Hey all, today's video is going to be about tier list predictions for Set 2 Shadows of the Galaxy. To start off, I am going to start with the final tier list from Set 1. If you want to skip forward to Set 2, I will have links to it in the description, timestamps for when I'm starting on Set 2. I want to start on Set 1 though, because I think it's important to define where the meta currently is before discussing where the meta will be. Jump into this. This is probably different than other tier lists you've seen, and there could be some notable exceptions. I have Boba Blue, a deck that I've been working on a lot for Set 1, at least the second half of it, if not more, and has performed extremely well for me in Tier S above everything else because I think it is definitively the best deck. I think it has good matchups into everything else on this list. I think if decks want to beat it, they have to tech for it specifically, and then that makes their matchups against everything else on this list skew towards losing. Or at least the aggro decks if they skew towards beating the control deck. The reason for that being that it attacks Sabine in a way that other control decks can't with Greedo, and having a high event density to the point where Greedo is almost always hitting for 3 and then flipping a non-unit and hitting for 5, which shuts down the Sabine matchup, meaning the worst matchup for most control decks being aggro is now mitigated. I have gone into that a bit more in other videos, and I do plan on doing a deck tech for this deck for Set 2, although I do think it will fall from Tier S to either Tier 1 or maybe even Tier 2, because there are a lot of anti-control cards coming into the meta, and this deck doesn't get anything except for Frozen and Carbonite. I have at Tier 1 the two versions of Sabine, because they are putting a clock on every deck in the game that every deck in the game struggles to stop. Both versions are good. They have different matchups. Sabine Yellow being better against the slower decks, and Sabine Green being better against faster, more board control oriented decks. They, I think, are definitively the decks that are best against everything after Boba Blue. Close behind them, I do have Boba Yellow. Boba Yellow does counter them, which within Tier 1 that does make it potentially the best. It's just it really struggles into Boba Blue and the unit-based control decks, Blue-Green Villainy. So I am hesitant to either move it up to S or move it up higher than the Sabines, although I will say these aren't in any particular order, although I do consider Tier 1 to be in this order. Maybe have Boba Yellow above Sabine Yellow. Boba Yellow is very good into the Sabine decks because it is the best at controlling the board. It's a tempo deck, so it is an aggro or faster deck that can interact with the board in very meaningful ways while still being able to race and go face. Cutting is a great card for that. It has Cantina Bouncer. Those are probably the biggest two for the matchup. And then stuff like Bosk, even just having strong units that can ambush. Boba's untap ability to get more units onto the field, although it does come out turn after Sabine. It's just a very good deck at dealing with the Sabines. It does struggle, even though on the surface it might seem like it doesn't. It does struggle a lot with control, because the cards that it uses to try to leverage an advantage against control, namely Cunning and Bodhi Rook, don't actually do the 2-for-1ing that they're supposed to. Bodhi Rook comes down, strips a card, but then gets 2-for-1'd by many of the ambush creatures or units or the leader in Boba Blue. Example of this would be if it comes down later in the game, which it normally does because they're normally saving it to try to strip Super Laser Blast, then they strip Super Laser Blast, and if there's a Bounty Hunter crew in the Boba Blue's hand, they just play Bounty Hunter crew, ambush the Bodhi, and now have the Super Laser blast right back into the hand if they even need it. They could just take Power of the Dark Side, Vanquish, make an opening, any of the other strong removal, Vigilance. So, and then Cunning also struggles there because it's going to discard a card at random, which can be very good and normally give +4. A lot of the times it does end up doing the bounce or the tap, but like normally you're looking to get the +4 attack with it. And then the Boba Blue player, it essentially trades 1-for-1 with the discard, and then it buffs a unit, but then the Boba Blue player trades 1-for-1 with the unit, so it's a net neutral trade. It doesn't actually provide any card advantage. And then Boba Yellow tops out after that. There are no real other ways for it to 2-for-1 Boba Blue or the control decks, and the control decks have a lot of ways of 2-for-1ing Boba Yellow. At tier 2, I have Han Green and Blue Green Villainy, and to a lesser extent Boba Green, and there's a very important reason why I have that at tier 2.5. That being that Han Green and Blue Green Villainy Control have a toolbox within set 1 that can push them towards focusing the slower decks or focusing the faster decks. Boba Green doesn't have that. Boba Green is very static in its list for set 1, and it doesn't really have the tools to target the slower decks. It is strictly a deck that targets the faster decks, and it does it very well, but then it struggles against the slower decks. Han Green can go either direction, and Blue Green Villainy can go either direction. The issue with those is that if they stay in the middle, they're normally not strong enough against the field to consistently win every matchup. It'll be closer to 50-50s than 60-40s or even 55-45s. And if they go towards one of the ends, being stronger against Sabine or Boba Yellow or stronger against Boba Blue, then they end up sacrificing the other side of that matchup, and you have to be against essentially a polarized field for them to target one of the sides and then hope that they either high roll if they get the weaker side or high roll and never hit that matchup. So I think that those are all definitively tier 2. Boba Green moves up to tier 2 once it gets the tools from set 2, which we'll go into. And then I have the Metacall category. You could say this is the tier 3 category. I'm going to talk about Iden Blue first. I'm very hesitant to even include this in the tier list because it is very good at dealing with the aggressive strategies, specifically Sabine. It ends up adding Cargo Juggernaut, where normally Vigilance would be, and Vigilance becomes a 4-drop slot. It has access to more healing than Boba Blue. However, it's at the cost of all of the tools that Yellow brings, namely Greedo, which, even though Greedo's for the aggro matchup, so it doesn't care about that one too much, but Bosk is insane against not just aggro, but anything that plays to the board, especially in an event-heavy deck. It gives up in the control mirror, which this is the kicker, it gives up cheaper Bounty Hunter Crew, cheaper Spark of Rebellion. And I don't think what it's gaining, if it gains anything at all, like any percentage points over Sabine, I don't think it's gaining enough to say that this should ever be played over Boba Blue. So I'm very hesitant to include it. It can be a meta call against a very Sabine-heavy meta, though, where you play that instead of Boba Blue. Vader and Palpatine are too slow against Sabine. Even with the ramp, by coming out at 7 resources, 8 resources, they will just auto-lose to Sabine. They will also struggle with Boba Yellow to an extent. Even some of the mid-range decks can go under them, like a very explosive Han or Boba game can get under them. But those are the decks that they are looking to target. Like, they're looking to target the tier 2, the tier 2.5, the mid-range decks, the unit-based control decks. They're very good at dealing with those because their flip side is so strong that it just ends up completely dominating the board. Palpatine taking a unit from the opponent, and Vader just being a very big body that is also dealing 2 damage to something on attack. Very hard for the mid-range decks and for the unit-based control decks to deal with. But because the Tier 1 decks are Sabine Wren and Boba Fett, and then there's also Boba Blue, Tier 1, Tier S, which also has a great matchup into Vader Green and the various versions of Palp, they're not really in the meta. You could say that they're Tier 3, you could say that they're meta calls, but they really don't have a place in the meta. The Set 1 meta, and this will continue into Set 2. This list is very much the same for Set 2. Not much will change, at least I'm predicting not much will change. Then from here, we go into the maybe eventually category tier and the no probably not tier. Here, I know that there's going to be takes on these and say like, no, these are meta decks. The reason why I don't have any of these in the meta decks is I don't think they compete with anything. Maybe some of the meta calls, maybe they have like specific individual matchups that are good. The maybe eventually tier against anything on this page. But by their nature, they are on the weaker side. If there was going to be a tier 4, we could say that they might be in tier 4, but I also have the eventually category because they need more tools. To talk about them briefly, Luke Skywalker flipping on 6 is a little too slow. He doesn't have ramp to accelerate it well, and even if he did have ramp, you would want it to be a 5 resource flip, not a 6 resource flip. And at 6 resources, you're looking at more meta calls like at 7 or 8 with Vader and Palpatine, where you compare their sides to just giving a shield on Luke Skywalker's flip. Vader and Palpatine are arguably better as on their unit side, even though they are 1 turn, 2 turns slower, but then they also have better access to ramp. Changes a little bit in Set 2, but I don't think the Set 2 ramp spell is anywhere near as good as Super Laser Technician is in Villainy. So I think Luke is definitively in the maybe eventually category. He did do well in some events, but the action of giving a shield, so we should also talk about that a little bit. Paying 1 resource to give a shield is probably a good rate. It's better than what I will talk about in Tarkin in Set 2 units, where it's paying 1 resource to increase the stats of a unit by 1/1, which is exactly what 1 resource converts to in stats. Giving a shield is better. It's just questionable of how good it actually is, and if it's even a worthwhile leader ability to increase the cost of any card by 1, essentially, to give it a shield. It does have some very good applications, but the leader being slow and the shield being questionable in some instances puts him solidly in this category of the tier list. Grand Inquisitor flips on 6, Hera flips on 6. That's going to be a pretty common theme, that the ones that flip on 6 are normally too weak on their unit side and too slow flipping on 6 to really find a place in the meta because of the meta calls of being the later flippers, just being stronger when you're waiting longer, and them not being they're not flipping fast enough to deal with Sabines. Grand Inquisitor in Set 1, I want him to be good. He's probably mechanically my favorite leader, or one of my favorite leaders, but he doesn't have good action economy. You're almost never taking the initiative. You're almost always just playing a unit, making it weaker to get an attack off, which then makes weaker units able to trade up into it easily. He's mechanically, it's kind of an anti-control, anti-slower deck card, where it's just like, okay, I'm just going to get stuff on the board and attack into it, attack base, and then because the slower decks aren't going to have good tools to trade up, they're not going to have a lot of lower end stuff to trade up into the units that I damage, then I'm still getting a lot of value from them. He doesn't have the tools to do that in Set 1. I don't think he's going to have the tools to do that in Set 2. Hera, the Spectres just aren't good enough for what she does. She flips on 6. She does give a free experience when she flips, which is very nice, but it's just not there. I don't know if it will be there. Maybe it will be. Like we can say eventually it might be if enough strong Spectre cards are printed. I'm more inclined to say that she should be in the probably not category of ever being playable. She's definitely not playable currently. She won't be playable in Set 2. Leia is such a cool card in my opinion. My friend actually plays essentially the Luke deck with Leia, which I think is better. He plays Leia Blue, and essentially the same exact a list as Luke with a few differences. And you gain access to U-Wing, Home 1 in that green heroic color combination, and then blue gives you access to some strong removal, it gives you access to regional governor, it gives you access to redemption if you want it. I feel like there should be a list there that Luke, and then this version of my friend's list where he's playing Leia with blue, there should be a list there that does exist. I think the issue there is the leaders are all bad for it. Because Leia doesn't do much for the list. The action condensing doesn't do much for that list. And then in Leia Red, with her ability to action condense on the attacks, it's very hard to actually stick to board. Basically, what I'm getting at is, on one hand, there is no good green heroic or blue heroic leader for a unit-based control deck or slower unit-based mid-range deck. Leia might be currently the best for that just by the value of her coming out on 5 and attacking for 4, being a 4/6 essentially that comes out on 5, which is something you need to be able to do to exist in a world of Sabine. But then her ability is pretty much useless in those unit-based mid-range control decks. And her ability where it would be good, which would be an aggro swarm deck, and the keyword there is swarm, isn't because you can't get enough units onto the field, and I don't think that that will change. I think people are hoping that a swarm deck might exist eventually, but I think the nature of even withdrawing 2 cards per turn, but only starting with 4, you run out of cards too quickly if you're playing 2 a turn. And then even if you're still just drawing 2 and playing 2 a turn from there, you have to stay very low to the ground. You can't really go over 3-4 resources. It's a very hard deck to, even in theory, like having theorized cards to make happen. You have to have a bunch of 2-for-1 cards, like the, I can't remember the name of the card. It's a 1/3 that draws another rebel, but that's a 1/3. It's like if that was a 3/1 or a 2/1, like had just one more power and drew another rebel, then that could be an option. If Cobb was a rebel, that could be an option for this type of deck. But currently, and I don't think in the future it will exist, maybe in the far future when card power levels pushed a lot, where you have cards recurring into themselves and you don't need to play a lot of resources and you can still just keep drawing cards and recurring your hand and going wide to the board. A card like Leia, a leader like Leia is going to be amazing. She's a very strong leader for swarm-based decks. Not currently there. I don't think it will be there, so she's firmly in this category in my opinion. Then we have the no probably not. I think the most controversial leader in here is going to be Qi'ra. I think he's only going to get worse going forward, even with more upgrades being printed for him because of something I'm going to get into in the set 2 evaluation, where decks that are going to be running a lot of upgrades are, by definition, not going to be good unless the upgrades are pushed, or the units that they're going on that synergize with them are pushed to a point where they have to be broken, in which case it will be a meta dominating, defining deck, which wouldn't be good then. So even though he's done well, he's won some store showdowns. I don't think he's ever performed well in a large event, but he's won some larger store showdowns or placed in top 8 in larger store showdowns. I think he has to go into the no probably not category because his leader side ability just isn't that good, and his flip side is pushing the deck in a direction that wants to play a lot of upgrades, which when you're playing a lot of upgrades, it also, you have to match how many units, balance how many units you're playing to how many upgrades, and if you draw just the unit side, then you don't have the upgrades they need to synergize with, and if you draw just the upgrade side, you don't have units on the field, so you just don't get to play the game. If you're trying to build Exodia on Qi'ra, then your opponent just plays something that kills upgrades and just sad, or plays something that just outright defeats Qi'ra and you're just sad, which there are more cards that are going to do that now in set 2. Both things. So I don't think this was a leader in set 1. I don't think it will be in set 2, although we're not talking about set 2 yet. Everyone else on here, I don't really think needs much time to be talked about. Chewbacca comes out too late on 7 resources, and if you're looking at him as an anti-aggro card, well, he flips on 7 resources, so how can he be an anti-aggro card? And then his ability's too narrow, and there's other cards that do that better. IG-88 should be a flip on 4, he's a flip on 5. The nature of giving +1/+0 for attacks isn't that strong as an action, even if it lets you action condense with it. You also see that in Jyn Ursa, where it's giving the defender -1/-0, which is similar, but then that's forcing you into board control, whereas IG is letting you just go face, but then like they're so conditional and hard to set up. Jyn also flips on 6, which, as we've talked about, 6 leaders are in a really weird spot and will be until Sabine rotates out, and hopefully nothing stronger than Sabine gets printed, or a 6 flip leader just has to be extremely pushed to be viable. Cassian, it's just super narrow. Flips on 6 again, so that's just already an issue. And how many cards do you want to draw? Like, if you're drawing cards, you're either in some type of control deck, but then if you're in a control deck, how much damage are you doing to base? Or you're in a swarm deck, but then if you're doing a swarm deck, wouldn't you prefer some other type of ability like Leia Organa? He does fix the issue in Swarm of running out of cards, so he could be put into the eventually category if we saw a lot of really powerful 1-cost and 2-cost units to the point where they're so pushed that you can just go very low to the ground and then use Cassian to keep drawing more. But I think you should assume that that's not going to happen, because that would probably be unhealthy for the game. So he's going to remain in the probably not category. Definitely for set 1, probably moving forward. Thrawn. I want to like Thrawn. Thrawn with GI is probably in my top 2 for mechanically the leader that I just want to play. He's also thematically from the story, like just somebody that I really enjoy. But he's had no good performances, and the nature of tapping something down is more tempo-oriented than control-oriented, and he seems more like a control-oriented leader looking at the top card of opponents' decks. And then even in tempo, the ability to tap things isn't really too big when it's at the cost of an action. It has to be action condensed for it to be good, and this isn't action condensed. Because you need a way to get the initiative still. Like, if you're just tapping something, letting them play something else to the board, and then have to play a removal on that, or you're slowing down your action economy to be able to tap something, they're probably still going to be able to untap and attack you with something. Due to that, I don't really see a shell for Thrawn ever existing that will be better than just playing Boba Blue or can't remember her name off the top of my head, but the set 2 yellow leader that's coming out that will also be, for the future, a good control leader. I think Thrawn will just sadly never have a place, and that's why I have him in probably not. But he could be in the eventually category. Tarkin, this is going to be a common theme, and why I'm putting him in the no and the probably not category, is paying 1 resource to give an experience just isn't good. It's not doing anything more than saying this card, like, I paid 1 extra for this card, and it's getting the exact minimum stats that it would get for being 1 more cost. You can think of cards as being like, let's use the 3 costs as an example. It should be 3/4, 4/3 is their base stat line. It should be a +1, not +1/+1, but as a card, +1 over the stat line. And then for every resource you put into it, it should give it 1/1. So a 3 cost would be 3/3, +1 over on either side, so 4/3 or 3/4 at base. And then what Grand Moff does is just say, okay, this is a 4-cost unit, and now instead of a 4/3 or 3/4, it's a 5/4 or 4/5. It also has deck building restrictions. Like, I don't even understand the point of even having a restriction on something like this. It doesn't make sense, and then they're in set 2, as we're going to see soon, they're doing a lot more like that, like Jyn Ursa, like IG-88. Even like, not really like Qi'ra, but Qi'ra would fall into this category where just actions like that just aren't really worth it. Even if they're action condensed, they're just not really worth it. So moving on to set 2. preface this saying that these are predictions. I am pretty confident in my predictions, but we will go back in like a month or two and after the set's released and look at these and see where I fall. You will quickly notice there are very few new leaders on this list. I think the majority of leaders from set 2 are going to fall into the maybe, eventually, probably not categories. Mostly because set 2 doesn't have an extremely pushed power level. There are some strong things coming out, but the power level of set 2 is just low. Even with the decks that already exist, I don't think they're really gaining much. They're going to be very, very similar to their set 1 lists and then just have a few cards to supplement them. So jumping into this, let's talk about first why I moved Boba Blue down from tier S to tier 1. Might even drop to tier 2 in my opinion. And that's because of cards like Phantom TIE Fighter, cards... I looked up her name before this for this purpose, and now it's slipping my mind. The yellow villainy 1/3 has smuggle. Play it, you look at your opponent's hand for 2. They discard. You choose a card from the discard and draw a card. So that's another way to hurt attack control. There's the new red card that makes them discard 2 cards for 1 card, so it's just the natural 2 for 1. There's the new black villainy card that makes them discard and you draw. There's a lot of new... There's Crate Dragon, which we can talk about like in terms of Han Solo ramp deck, a red-green ramp deck that attacks control. There are a lot of new ways to attack control, and control, like event-based control, gets nothing. Nothing. There's an argument for Frozen and Carbonite. I don't think it's a good one because it is not doing... I will be trying to slot that into Boba Blue in some capacity, but as I've talked about a lot with this deck, the lines that you need against Sabine, the lines that you need against Boba Yellow, the lines you need against the other tier 1, even tier 2 decks don't facilitate not having events and not being able, because you need, and not removing a unit. And Frozen and Carbonite does not remove the unit, so you can't get the mana, the resource back from using it. And getting that resource back is so important for the lines that Boba Blue has. So this deck doesn't change, where every other deck is at least getting something. I'm very disappointed in that. I was really hoping for anything at 3 resource or 2 resource cost in yellow or blue that removed units better than Waylay. Waylay is the weak link in this deck. Make an Opening to a lesser extent is a weak link in this deck, and at least a card to replace one of those or some combination of those that is an event and costs 3 or 2 is really what this deck needed to remain tier 1. I'm hopeful it'll still be tier 1, but I could definitely see this dropping down to tier 2 because of all the anti-control cards coming out. Sabine, it's Sabine. She's going to be... There shouldn't be... Also, to comment on Sabine and Boba as leaders, there shouldn't be leaders that surpass them. There could be leaders like, for example, the ramp-based leaders that get pushed up into tier 1 by having decks that are strong enough against the entire field to be considered tier 1. But Sabine and Boba should be the gold standard for what the highest power level should be until they rotate out. So it shouldn't be a surprise that I keep these tier 1 and that they likely will remain tier 1. They get some new cards added, which is nice. Boba Yellow, Sabine Yellow, and Sabine Green. I don't think there's much more to say about it. They're just, they're the strongest leaders. They're going to remain the strongest leaders until they rotate, hopefully. And they get some new cards. Like, it's still, I don't see this changing. They're still going to be the tier 1. Tier 2, I could see tier 2, like stuff like Han and Boba jumping up to tier 1 if there's a way to make the list, to design the list in a way that is strong enough against the field, against everything, where it can deal with, the ramp decks can deal with Boba Blue, and they could deal with the metacalls. If there is a way to set up Han, set 2 Han Green, set 1 Han Green, and Boba Green, or blue villainy unit control, basically all the ramp decks, if there's a way to set them up so that they can deal with all the tier 1 decks and all the metacall decks, then these all shift up to tier 1. I'm just not sure if it's there. I could be wrong on that prediction, but I'm pretty sure just ramp as essentially a broad archetype is going to remain tier 2. It does have now a red-green ramp in Han Solo. I'm not sure if that is going to remain tier 2, if that might be the one that goes tier 1, or it might fall into the eventually category, because it is the most conditional ramp, in that it only works on units. I think there's something there, though. Boba Green gets bumped up from tier 2.5 to at least tier 2 because of the discard unit that I was talking about. The 1/3 smuggle, discard a card from the hand, draw a card, and Phantom TIE Fighter, giving it good tools now against control. Vader also hits both of those. In my starting list, I will just make a small tangent that I've moved, even though I don't want to talk about lists too much in this. I did move Vader to sideboard and put in Maul in main because I want to be able to attack life total and put pressure on with Boba Green more than try to draw out the game and like slow down the game by playing anti-control tools. But I definitely see this being tier 2. Maybe it won't be, maybe it'll still be tier 2.5, because I'm not sure how it'll compare to the 3 other ramp decks on this list. It might still be polarized to be only really strong against the aggressive decks and still not have the toolbox, or maybe like the toolbox won't be as good as at attacking the aggressive decks as these other decks are, or you'll have to like choose one direction or the other, but that would be by definition keep it in tier 2. I don't have much else to say about Red Han with ramp. We have to see where the deck list leads. Green Han, Yellow Han with green. It's getting some tools. I don't know what they are directly off the top of my head, but I think it'll probably still end up polarized on either direction. So I'm predicting that that'll stay tier 2. Qi'ra comes in as a new alternate option in blue-green villainy control. It might be the de facto best. We have to see how it works out. There are some cool things that she could do, like turn 1 with the new 1-drop, 1/4 grit, bounty, draw a card. She can make a 3/2 shielded on turn 1, which is very cool. If she's paired with stuff like Scalpbreak's Pursuer as well on turn 2, she can make a 3/2 shielded. There is an argument for saying like, oh, when she flips, she's giving shields and all she's doing is healing grit units to full health, which removes their grit bonus when she flips, and then popping her shields. But the whole interaction there, I think, is you're using those shields to remove the aggressive unit from like Sabine and from Boba and from like the early plays from the other decks. You use those shields to get rid of them, and then when she flips, she just heals them back to full and then resets their grit value. She's very good at dealing with opposing leaders. She is, as has been talked about many places elsewhere, she pretty much every leader in the game, if they flip, you just flip Qi'ra and then she just trades into them, or you flip Qi'ra and then something else can trade into them, or you just overwhelming barrage right after. The main downside is that she doesn't have healing, which might be made up for by dealing the damage and then setting up overwhelming barrages that just clear the board, because overwhelming barrage exists in this color combination. Or just setting up other units to just clear the board after she flips, where you can just trade in because everything has a low life total. Blue made the argument for adding Devotion into main deck potentially to get healing if it's necessary. It's just a question of how necessary is it. I do think we are looking at her being the de facto best leader, though, for unit-based blue-green villainy. I would also like to add that I almost added blue-red control, or maybe like event control or unit control as a potential Qi'ra option, because she works really well with Bombing Run, and she works well with Wild Rancor to flip, deal damage, and then to have them clear up, to have those cards clean up the board. But we could just circle back to, if you're playing control, why are you not playing yellow? No matter what you're bringing, unless yellow control is completely out of the meta, which I don't think it will be, you're sacrificing Bounty Hunter Crew and you're sacrificing Spark of Rebellion being discounted in the mirror, in which case, why are you not playing, if you're playing control, why are you not playing blue-yellow? Then we can move down to meta calls for set 2. Jabba is coming in, filling a very similar role to Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader. I think what we may end up seeing as the game progresses and more big tournaments happen, if these do perform well, I think one of them will pull ahead of the others because they're all doing very similar things. They're all trying to control board. They all come out late. They're all attacking the tier 2 level. So if tier 2 ever becomes the prominent level played, all the tier 2 decks are skewed towards beating the aggro decks, or they're able to shore up their matches against aggro and blue, yellow villainy control. Then these, essentially the tier 3 could then shift up to rock, paper, scissors and beat out the tier 2, and one of these leaders with one of their color combinations would likely pull ahead of the others. Although, like, if we look at tier 2, they're all technically tier 2 decks. They're all doing very similar things with ramp. This metacall list is also ramping. So we are seeing everything but tier 1 is a ramp deck, essentially. I still do have Item Blue on here, although I've made a strong argument for why she shouldn't be. But I don't think anything changes for set 2. I think we have the addition of a couple, 3 new leaders that slot into what was already happening in set 1. Jabba's going to have the most unique new deck because it's getting with the yellow combination, or just in green. It could also be paired with blue, so maybe I should add a blue there. It's getting the 3/4 that can come out on turn 1. If Jabba doesn't have initiative or passes and they play a unit, give that unit a bounty, and then the new 3-cost unit that's a 3/4 gets discounted if there's an opposing bounty, and then you get a 3/4 on turn 1. On turn 2, you can play a 4/3 shielded if you're playing yellow. If you give a bounty, it doesn't take initiative, which could be an issue. It's a 7-cost flip, so it's going to struggle a lot against the Sabines. It's also going to struggle a lot against the event-based control decks. With yellow, it does have access to the cards that I've been talking about that yellow villainy get that are anti-control, so there is some wiggle room there. So like maybe you can shore up the event control matchup a bit. I don't think it ends up being more than a narrow niche deck, though. It is going to be the deck that probably uses the most newest cards. Now we're going to get into the more controversial stuff. Again, the maybe eventually, just like set 1, is going to be controversial. I don't think any of the ones that I talked about from set 1 are going to be pushed for set 2, and if they're not getting pushed now, I just think these leaders don't get pushed at least as long as Sabine exists. In terms of Hera, Grand Inquisitor, and Luke. I don't think Leia gets pushed by the virtue of the cards that should go in a Leia deck shouldn't be printed. So they're saying, and maybe eventually for now, maybe we'll see them come out in set 2. Maybe GI becomes a metacall where he now has the tools to attack the control decks well enough where if everybody's playing a slower control-oriented deck, then GI shifts up. The issue there being, I think in set 2 there's a very good GI yellow deck, but I think he wants to be paired with green, and until GI green becomes playable, I don't think he shifts into that metacall territory, because I think the other metacalls do it better, because again, all of these metacalls are attacking the slower board-based decks. It's just GI is attacking essentially all the slow decks, including event control. He might be there. We'll see. It depends on where the meta settles. I just think flipping on 6 is going to be an issue. Kind of needs to be paired with green then to ramp him so that he can come out early enough to deal with Sabines, but then also against Sabines you don't want to be ramping. So it's just in that awkward 6-cost leader flip spot that as long as Sabine exists or a strong 4-flip leader that can push damage really quickly exists, which we're now going to see with Kylo, I'm not sure if he ever exists. To move on to the set 2 leaders, Dr. Aphra and Kylo I think are the most definitively set up for the eventually category, because I don't think there's enough discard interaction yet. Once we see discard interaction to a level that will make these leaders good, I think they will quickly become broken. I am slightly concerned for the future because of that. I think there will eventually be a set that just breaks these, as long, like, hopefully that set happens when they're out of rotation, maybe, or there is a deck that does come out that is balanced enough that doesn't break these. Afra, I think she's just bad right now. If you're playing, like, everyone's saying, like, oh, play her in blue-yellow villainy control, and I do think she would slot above Thrawn currently, but she doesn't compete with Boba. Boba's just, there's no competition there. The resource generation from Boba is too strong. Being a 4/7 is too strong. Afra coming out is a potential 5/5 that draws you one of 3 random cards, and hopefully you've flipped 3 removals that you can choose. I don't think it's it. I think, we'd be looking at potentially a Reanimator deck with her, which there is the Reanimator card in green, but it's too narrow. It only saves 2 resources. Isn't that huge? There aren't many good force cards to use it with. The best force card to use it with is Palpatine, which is in red. You could play that of Aspect Palpatine. It's not there. Kylo, similarly, you're gonna have to compare him to the Sabine aggro deck. He's more often than not, unless you play an extra card from your hand, gonna flip as a 4/4, which is still good. He's gonna have the downside of running out of gas, unless there's more discard interaction, with just like having Kylo's tie essentially is the only discard action that you care to play. And still having to pay for the card, like, it's there with Kylo's tie. Like, he wants stuff like that, and until there's more stuff like that, he's just gonna run out of gas. He also suffers from, he doesn't want to give his +2/+0 until your opponent's done taking actions, so he never really wants to take initiative, which is not what an aggro deck wants to do. It's just not there. He could be an enabler for the early and like a red-green villainy ramp deck. He could be the enabler for getting the early Palp out with the Reanimator spell. But then do you really want this to be your leader for that? I don't think he just doesn't shift up into this. It's not there. Then Bo-Katan, Cad, and Hondo. A lot of leaders from set 2 I struggled to either put into the maybe eventually or the no probably not category. Bo-Katan flips on 6. That doesn't work against Sabine. The Mando package is pretty good. But flipping on 6, you naturally want to play that with green to deal with, all the ramp decks here, to deal with the Sabine decks. You normally want to accelerate yourself a little bit to make a 6 cost work, and then you have to deal with the Metacall ones as well, that just then, if you're accelerating, those Metacall ones are stronger, even though they come out a turn one turn or 2 turns later. Her ability's cool. It works really nice. I think she pairs best with blue currently, which isn't green, and it is a very interesting deck. I played against it with Boba Blue, essentially just set 1 Boba Blue villainy. And the fact that all of her units have 6 power and she's giving out a lot of shields, it did make it hard to interact with, but the only game I lost was the game that I didn't draw a single Super Laser Blast. There could be, an argument there for, like, okay, you run Regional Governor, you run an out-of-aspect discard card to make it work so that you can pull the Super Laser Blast, and then maybe she could be, like, work against Control, but then does she work against Sabine? And I fear that she doesn't. I fear that Sabine will just be able to go face, and then even with her ability to ping units for 1, flipping on 6 is going to be too slow to get the double ping. I just don't think it's going to be there. Maybe it is, and that's why I have her in the maybe category. But I think it's more likely going to be probably not, and she's probably going to stay there for a while in the probably not category. But maybe. Cad Bane flips on 6. His ability works well. Oh, man, I meant to look up the name of this this unit. The 1-drop that 04, when you play an Underworld unit, ping base, like, you can set it up, like, you can play that and then just build an Underworld deck, and you play an Underworld unit, it hits base for 1, and then they choose a unit to deal damage to, but the fact that they choose, not good. Not good. I don't see him, again, being able to deal with Sabine. I don't know if the Underworld trait itself is going to be good enough to make this deck work as like a mid-range deck, because it would be like some type of unit-based deck. Most likely mid-range, because he flips on 6. If you flip on 6, you can't be an aggro deck. Even flipping on 5 is hard to be an aggro deck. I'm not really sure this guy has a place. I think maybe he should be in the probably not, but maybe somebody can find something that works for him. But again, like, look at what you're competing with. I don't think so. I think he's probably going to be probably not. Hondo flips on 6. He's the best leader between him and Lando. He's probably the better leader for Smuggle. The issue with Smuggle, which I'll also get into with Lando, is that the front side of Smuggle has to be strong enough, like without the Smuggle cost. Like if you're playing it without Smuggle, this unit has to be a strong unit for that card to be good. If you're just like resourcing it and then paying 2 extra for it later, like there's like a very small subsection of cards that actually, there are some, but there's a very small subsection of cards that actually fit that category where their non-smuggled side is a very high tier card. And then he flips on 6, so he's not really passing the Sabine test. Giving an experience normally isn't that strong. We've talked about it elsewhere, where paying 1 resource to give an experience is probably never going to be good. But doing it for free could be. Like, if you were to give experience, you kind of need it to be for free, and it is action cheating, which is good. Like, you don't have to pay an action for it. Like, there are those factors that are being like, wow, this card can be really good. Maybe somebody will figure something out for it. Why I put him in maybe. But I don't think the Smuggle cards are there for him. I don't think Smuggle should be pushed. I just don't like Smuggle as a mechanic. In the future, if it gets pushed more, maybe it becomes a thing, but then if it gets pushed more, you just end up with slowing down the pace of the game, with people looking at their Smuggle cards, their resources all the time. Kind of like have to be playing Smuggle then, like the game just becomes Smuggle.game because there's going to be too much card advantage built into it. This mechanic probably shouldn't have been made. It's cool though. Maybe it works out. We'll see. I'm going to keep him in maybe for now. I have a feeling he's going to shift towards the no, probably not category. And then notable mention for here, Sabine Red. Getting some cool new tools. I don't think it cares. Getting a 3/3 within red that draws potentially 2 cards. Cool. It works with Sabine, but it's not a rebel. You have Gar Saxon in double red, you have Aggression in double red, you have Something War, the new war card that burns based on cards in hand, but that's like super niche. Like, the issue with that one is, excuse me if the mic picked that up, the issue with that one is the opponent is more often than not going to control how many cards they have in their hands. Or like, if it became a thing, decks would be designed in a way that the opponent gets cards out of their hands. It also doesn't synergize well with discard effect, which is how you're going to want to attack normally decks that are drawing a lot of cards. I think that card's being very overrated currently. I think 4 Cause is definitely the direction that Burn Aggro wants to go, and not this new deal damage based on cards in hand. I think if that card did exist, it would want to be in a deck that actually forces people to draw cards, like both players draw cards, which doesn't really exist currently. I don't really see this being a thing. I think you want to run the Rebel package. Also, the 3/3 that this gets isn't a Rebel, so even though it can draw cards, it's not a Rebel. Doesn't synergize with the Rebel package. You're playing cards that aren't heroic, that don't synergize with 4 Cause, and 4 Cause is going to be the stronger finisher to pair with Sabine. I don't think this is going to be a thing. I think we're going to be looking at Sabine Yellow, we're going to be looking at Sabine Green. I think those are still going to be the de facto best aggro decks, best decks to put a clock on the opponent, and Sabine Red is still, it might be there in eventually category. Like, it is nice that it now got some more double red tools. I don't think they're strong enough to push it. It has to get, essentially, it has to get double red tools that let it move away from the heroic rebel category, or it has to get double red heroic tools, like if they add a 3 aspect cards, which I assume they'll do eventually. So I definitely think this is solidly an eventually. Out of all of the cards, out of all the leaders here, I think we're looking at Sabine red paired with aggression, Kylo, Afra, and GI being the most likely to fall into the eventually category, and then all of the others probably not. Maybe for now, but probably not. And then, sad to say, I do predict that a lot of these leaders aren't going to see play. I'll go into why. I know a lot of people have been hot on a lot of these, but I think there's very clear-cut reasons why they shouldn't be. Rey, I think, is going to... The top row is all going to have to do with like giving experience, giving buffs on units, which we've talked about elsewhere. Same with Gar Saxon, but it's going to be for a different reason. Even Bosk. Rey, we can just dismiss. She's very similar to Tarkin. You're just paying an extra resource to increase the cost of a unit by 1 to give it the stats that it would get for that. It's not doing anything special. The cards that it would be targeting have to, like, you'd have to be curving out in a way where you're playing under curve and always give it, like, it just doesn't work well. Not a good concept to have action pay a resource. Like, if it was action condensed, like this was included in the cost of the unit, that could be really good. I actually just thought of that now. That should have probably been something I talked about earlier. But if this was play a unit or something, like it had some way to action sheet the extra experience, I could see that being good. But ultimately, that would still just be like increasing the cost of the unit to the equivalent of what it would be to give that +1/+1. Anyways, it's not a good concept. Finn is just basically turning experience tokens into shields. Shields are slightly better than experience. He does a very slow combo with Rose. That's been talked about a lot elsewhere. It's not good. I don't think it'll be good. There would have to be something very broken made to make this good. Also, Rey flips on 6. Finn does flip on 5, and he's well statted for 5. A 4/6 for 5 is not bad at all, but then the ability is just so mediocre, like, it's probably not going to happen. Green Boba Fett. I know a lot of people are so hot on this as a potential mid-range leader. Flips on 6. I don't think he's too well statted for flipping on 6. Like 4/7, 4/6 is still actually like, it's there. But flipping on 6, looking at what you're competing with, I don't think it's it. And then the virtue of giving +1/+0, the whole like -1 -0 +1/+0 argument, like just mildly augmenting stats of units. I don't think it competes with stuff that just deals 1 damage, stuff that helps you ramp, stuff that gives shields, stuff that, like the unit sides of the Metacall category. His unit side just isn't equivalent to the power of the unit sides of the Metacall category. Like, okay, you play, I don't know, green, yellow, heroic, Boba, make all your ambushes hit for 1 more. Like, okay, you're just trading your ambush units up, hopefully, but probably just 1-for-1ing them. Maybe there's something here. I am much more inclined to say there's probably not something here. If he cost 5 to flip, I would probably have him in the maybe category. But him costing 6 to flip, I think he's solidly in the probably not category. Cool ability, doesn't cost an action, which is always nice. Giving just +1/+0 isn't that good, in my opinion. And then he flips on 6, so like, whatever. Probably not going to be a deck. Moff Gideon falling into the category of just slightly modifying stats. More conditional than a lot of the other ones. Has to be on something that costs with 3 or less. It does action condense, which is nice, but who cares giving +1/+0? Like, what? Why am I not just playing Sabine if I'm playing a faster deck? Like, it's a common theme of this video, many of you may notice, Sabine's kind of setting a benchmark for a lot of other leaders where until she rotates out, and under the condition nothing of her power level is printed, none of these other leaders can really shift into the meta. But even with that being said, this is just very conditional. I don't think it's that good. The flip side gives overwhelm to him as well, but then who cares? It's a weak unit anyways. What are you really overwhelming? You're fighting for board control, so you're trying to target the Sabines, like the aggro decks, and just like removing their units while also dealing damage. It's good in theory. I haven't actually tested it yet, but I'm assuming it'll be bad in practice. Could be in the maybe category. I'm going to put it in probably not for now as the prediction, and then we'll see how it progresses. Then we're going to move into what I call the upgrade category. I briefly talked about this with someone else. I think it was Jabba. I'll just say it again. The issue with the upgrade category is that you have to design your deck in a way that has upgrades and has units. And it's going to be very inconsistent. It's going to be very hard to set up a consistent deck that you have a high enough density of upgrades to make the upgrade worth it, like the upgrade effect on the leaders worth it, and a high enough density of units so that you always have units that synergize with your upgrades. Just by definition, this is probably not anything that comes out that's like this, unless these cards are extremely pushed, in which case this is just a very polarizing mechanic. It can then quickly become broken and just dominate the meta, and I think that's something as a designer needs to always think about when making stuff. Although this set is also developed for limited. Keep in mind, and I should have said this at the start of the video, this is purely for constructed that we're talking about right now. There's also the limited aspect, which completely changes the field. But in terms of constructed, as a design concept, this should never really be something that is pushed to be constructed playable. Gar Saxon flips on 6, so that's already an issue. Have to run upgrades. He's the most firmly in that category of you're running upgrades to get your units stronger, and you don't really want to be doing that because the deck's not going to be consistent. He does return upgrades on his flip side, but he's flipping on 6. Maybe if he flipped on 4 or 5 and you could chain upgrades like that, but then you'd be pushing the broken category. I don't think it's going to be a thing. I think this is actually more towards no than even probably not. Bosk is going to fall maybe more towards probably not, but again, because of needing to split your deck between upgrades to give bounties and units, there's going to be consistency issues. He does flip on 5. He's got very good stats for flipping on 5 at 4-6. He's definitely towards probably not towards no, maybe even maybe, but because of the way this archetype is going to play, I think we could safely put him into probably not. We'll see what happens. I have seen the decks that have been coming out with him. I've played against them. They can do some really explosive and cool things, but they just run out of gas, or they draw the wrong half of their deck, and then it's over. Mandalorian is probably the most approachable from these because it's going to fit into a control-y tempo style deck where you don't necessarily have to play upgrades for your units. You could play stuff like Frozen and Carbonite if it wasn't villainy. You could play stuff like Entrenched, but just to give an example of upgrades that aren't necessarily played on your units, they can do control-y type stuff, Traitorous, and then tap something down as well. Issue there being, it's 4 or less. If this wasn't capped at 4 or less, I would have this in maybe for sure. 4 or less, I think we have to put him into probably not. What do you do with a deck like this? Like, okay, you make like an anti-aggro kind of style deck, where then it would be a meta call where it's specifically anti-aggro. There's better meta calls for that. You know, all of the tier 2 decks essentially. Even though they can struggle against it, but better meta calls for anti-aggro. He also flips on 6, not 5, which is an issue. You'd have to run ramp with him. To small tangent here, Yellow Hondo is good at flipping on 6 because he ramps as an action himself. So like in addition to running resupply and now the new ramp card, he also just ramps as his own action, which essentially just makes him a 5 resource unit by default. This is just 6 resources. It's probably not. It's not going to be a thing. I can't see it working out. Then the bottom row, Fennec's falling into a similar issue as Mando, where this could be a good ability. We have to look at, is Ambush worth 1 resource? We can say it probably is, but as the game is progressing into set 2, Ambush is worth more like half a resource, where it's worth like 1 stat, not a 1/1 stat. We could say, and by default, we've established that 1 resource is equal to 1/1. And now we're seeing stuff like Forlom come out. We're seeing stuff like the new Space Ambush unit that has Raid 1 or Raid 2, and then it's hitting as a 4/4 with Ambush. As more stuff like that comes out, it's devaluing the cost of Ambush. Ambush then becomes more like half a resource because it's only costing you 1 point of stats. And this is a full resource to give something Ambush. But then we're looking at more so the 4 or less clause. It's too limiting. It's going to be similar to Mandalorian. It's going to be like falling into like, okay, you're making an anti-aggro type of deck, and then you're just bad against the rest of the field. Could be an argument for it to be in a metacall field, but it's just, I don't see it being generally good enough for this to be a thing. It's also just a 4/4 when it flips. Not that good. I don't think Fennec ends up being a thing. So more towards no than probably not. Hunter is almost definitively no. He's coming out on 7. His hero side and his leader side and his unit side aren't that strong for 7 costs. The drawing of an extra card, well, returning a resource and putting, like, it's essentially drawing. Drawing of an extra card in the very conditional way it is, as many other people have said, you need a lot of cards of that name for it to be good. But then even at that, he's coming out on 7, and then how much do you care? Like, it would have to be a green. So, something to consider when I talked about Leia and my friend's version of basically putting her in the Luke deck. A good leader for green-blue heroic unit mid-range control does not exist. It's still not existing in this set. Hunter could have potentially filled that spot. I don't think the drawing mechanic is really what that deck needs. It needs something more oriented towards generating resources or influencing the board, which Hunter doesn't do. But I think Hunter is closer than the other ones in terms of leader ability, but then flipping on 7, it's just not it. And I think we can definitively say, not definitively, but lean it more towards this will most likely remain no perpetually because of his flip cost, than towards probably not or eventually category. And then Lando is just bad. What they were thinking when... I'm not going to go that... Let's not say that. Let's talk about why he might... Why I think he's bad, or why I'm predicting he'll be bad. It's removing the increased cost from Smuggle, but then it's also removing the card advantage cost from Smuggle, and as you may remember when I talked about Hondo, there has to be a density of Smuggle cards that are strong enough without their Smuggle costs to make Smuggle viable, which we simply don't have, and honestly shouldn't have. So this is just kind of a waste of a mechanic. Probably could have done something better. But again, we're talking about constructed. Limited, it's very cool. I'm loving this for limited. And if we rephrase this entire video in terms of limited, then we could be looking at something very different. But in terms of constructed play, this is not it. This will not be it. This is definitively no. You're making the smuggle cards cost their default value, and not having the card generation from them, which in theory should first off not be on an aggro skewed leader, which this is an aggro skewed leader, which is very odd. It should be on like a mid-range or control oriented leader. So because then you'd have a wider range of cards that can be included. But with this, you're only looking at then, like, the threshold is you need strong smuggle cards that are good without their smuggle cost, that are also cheap cards. Like, there's so many loops that this leader has to jump through to be good. So Lando's just not it. I don't think there's much to say about any of the set 1 leaders either. I think there's pretty clear-cut arguments for why they will never be good. And Cassian being maybe the one notable exception. Maybe Thrawn, but probably not. Sure, if they just really push upgrades to a point where it's like makes this unit untargetable or something, but that shouldn't exist as a card ever. So I think that that's where we end up. So those are my predictions for set 2 meta. I think this is going to be what we're looking at. And I will follow this video up in the future. Probably 1 to 2 months, maybe sooner, maybe longer. Most likely within 1 to 2 months after the set releases and we start seeing some tournament results. But seeing how even in set 1, the Boba Blue deck, I wouldn't have even put into the definitive best deck until basically towards the very tail end of the set, because it took me a very long time to find the exact 60 cards that just really attacked the meta in a very efficient way. This might be something that's better to revisit in the far future of set 3 coming out. So I will revisit again in the future. I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, subscribe, even hit the bell if you liked this video, and I will be uploading more soon. Have a great one.